So the starting point, when an athlete first comes down to the track, this is a slide that Joe's put in. What's the impairment? What caused it? How did they acquire the impairment? Were they born with it? I don't know whether you want to perhaps talk through those two. Those two sort of go fairly hand in hand, really, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, what you get, and so live example, I've got a chap that's just come to me in the last 15 months who 2.5 years ago was a professional rugby player and broke his tib and fib playing rugby, went to get it fixed, got compartment syndrome. 2 years ago, had the bottom part of his right leg amputated. Never thought he was going to be able to do sport again. And now he's training to sprint 1 and 2. So how did he acquire the impairment? He's had a catastrophic event. We've got people that have come through the armed forces that have had catastrophic events, people with car accidents, people that have had illnesses that have caused them to have an impairment. But then you get people that are born with the impairment. Richard Whitehead, Johnny Peacock, they're all born with an impairment, and then they've maybe had operations when they were younger to improve their quality of life with the impairment they had. Or you're born with cerebral palsy. So they're the two things that's worth understanding, because generally you'll see two different types of athlete, whether they come through an impairment from birth or whether they come through with an impairment from a catastrophic event. So that's why those questions are in there. How does it affect them? Someone that was born with that impairment would have learned to manage it from the time they've been very, very young. So if you've had an amputation and you've had it from a very young age, your understanding of managing an amputation is really good. And they tend not to have the issues that someone with a new amputation would have. Understanding, sorry, go on, Graham.
The types of issues, we discussed it earlier, the types of issues somebody, especially, leg amps will have is soreness at the bottom of the stump, possible rubbing, blisters coming up, things like that. And it's just something to be aware of. And as you get to know the athletes and get an open and honest relationship with them, you're able to talk to them about how things are feeling. You can't necessarily do the quantity of work that you can with able-bodied athletes just because of the soreness. But that comes down to an individual, knowing them, making sure that they've got correctly fitting prosthesis as they grow, especially with kids that, obviously the leg grows and that fitting into the cup, it needs remolding. And that's where you're probably more aware than perhaps the parents are, and a good relationship with the centre they're based at is really worthwhile. The athletes I've had come from mainly 2 centres, and I do know the physios there and can email them if we need to, just to discuss any issues that they might be having.
And ask the athlete; they know better than any of us.
Yeah.
Be really honest with them. Ask them. They're great at giving you the information that you're asking for, rather than you trying to imagine what the issue is. Ask them. They're very honest, very forthright, and they will tell you. And it's the best way of gleaning information about that individual athlete.
I like the third one, especially, Joe. Who else has the same or similar impairment? Who can I compare to? I'm a big believer in looking at athletes that are competing right at the top of the level, looking at how they move, how they produce movement, how they overcome the disability, what they're doing, how different is it to an able-bodied athlete, what I might need to adapt. And, one example is T37 athlete who didn't have much movement in his arm. You look at some of the 37s, and they get movement by not necessarily thinking about the angles of the arms, getting everything absolutely perfect, but by totally loosening the arm and allowing it to move and almost throwing it backwards and forwards and getting the turnover that way, which is, would you teach an able-bodied athlete to do it? No, you wouldn't. But it's a lot more preferential than the athletes, just tightening up and not moving it at all, because what is athletic movement about? It's creating freedom, it's creating speed of movement, it's creating movement in the right direction and things like that. So I'm a real big believer in showing athletes videos, getting them to think about things, getting them to think about, what they might be able to do, how they can improve that, and what they can do.
Will we move on to the next slide?
Yeah. Starting out, when the athletes come down, first off, they tend to be younger athletes, tend to be starting out. I really encourage them to just get stuck into school PE, school competitions, do as much as they possibly can. Really encourage them to get involved in club competitions, perhaps some of the lesser meetings, but where they can go along and they can compete against other athletes and just get that interest in competing, but alongside perhaps people that they're training with and people who know them, and getting that interest, depending on the disability that they've got. A lot of the different disability organisations organise their own competitions. CP Sport have competitions. INAS, which is for athletes with an intellectual disability, have their own competitions. The Activity Alliance organise competitions, I think 1 or 2 a year, whereby it tends to be borough-based competition. Borough-based athletes go down as a borough, and that's a really good place for them to go down in a really open, welcoming environment to actually go and get involved in competition. It might be something that they've never done before. Do you want to talk at that stage, Joe, about perhaps some of the complications that you find? I don't know whether anybody's got any questions on this. Some of the complications you find on new athletes coming down with a disability, what you may need to do differently.
Well, I mean, look, my approach to this has always been, it's about our job as coaches is to look at the ability of the individual, not the disability of the individual. Every athlete that comes down, regardless whether they got an impairment or not, generally has an ability to do something. I break the athlete down into 2 different schools of thought. One is poor movement because of their impairment. So whether they got, cerebral palsy or whatever it is, they'll have some poor movement that's learned, that's there because of the impairment that they've got. And we can improve balance in some bits to help, but we will never get rid of it. But then there's a vast majority of the movement generally is poor learned movement. And that's simply because the body is adapted so that individual can move in a more comfortable way, or in a way that the body changes to want it to move, which is not necessarily the way that we want them to move, for them to run quick or jump far.
I think it's also a safety factor. You get quite a few athletes, especially amputee, CP, they put themselves into a position where they feel that they're safe, and they're not going to fall over. And as Joe said, that learned movement is something that you can overcome.
So, and just from my experience, and Gemma, who's one of the physios down at Loughborough, we were having a chat looking at an athlete, and we were kind of saying that probably 70% of the movement when an athlete turns up is probably poor learnt movement, because there's so much that you can do to change that person just by looking at balance and coordination. And the thing that we do when we teach athletes in general, but para athletes specifically massively change their whole kind of lifestyle, because they then learn to cope very differently, because they have new skills and are better balanced, and they move better. So you don't just change their ability to run on the track or jump at the track, you change how they functionally move and on a day-to-day basis. And when you do that and you change people's life like that, it is incredible how some of these athletes can then progress and perform.
I've got a little lad who comes down, double baloney amputee. He's been coming down for about 2 years. He came down, his walking was awful. We had to start off teaching him how to walk, how to control his core. He'd arch his back and his hips were right back and swing his legs around. We had to change the way he walked, so that all the time he was working on freeing up hip flexors to move, being able to lift his legs, controlling through his core rather than through the lower back. We had to change all of that before we even really got him properly doing any running or doing anything. Since then, he now plays cricket. He's at secondary school. He does the cross countries with all the athletes at secondary school, everything else. And as Joe said, as well as helping them athletics wise, you're absolutely changing potentially somebody's life by giving them that ability to do things that they might not have been able to do before. And that to me is one of the greatest privileges of coaching, is being able to do that.
So, and one of the reasons for this slide being in there, and when I did a webinar for England Athletics last year, I called it "It's Just Coaching," because that's what I want you to take away. I want you to take away the fact that this is just coaching. Every athlete, whether you got an impairment or not, is going to turn up at your club or on your track, and they will need some help biomechanically or functionally moving. That's exactly what you're doing. You're going to ask the athlete the same questions. The likelihood is they'll probably throw more challenging questions at you, a para-athlete, but that's the skill of a coach, being able to kind of understand the athlete, develop the person, and then develop the athlete. So yeah, it is, honestly, it's just coaching. So that speed strength curve that you've got there, it's exactly what we'd walk through with what we presume to be an able-bodied athlete, is exactly what we try and walk through with a para-athlete. You're still trying to create strength, you're still trying to create speed, you're still trying to create power. You want to get better velocity into the floor. It's all the same. Would you agree, Graham?
Completely, yeah. It's all about speed, force production, how you get them moving and create the power and force in the right direction. And it is all about that. And if you understand how to teach an able-bodied athlete sprinting, you adapt that really, really easily to disability athletes. And I actually really believe it's made me a much better coach for all my athletes, is by working with disability athletes, because it's made me question movement a lot more and think about it a lot more. So no, absolutely, totally agree on that.
And I agree with you. I believe it is, in coaching in general, it makes you not assume, which I think is a really good thing about coaching. It makes you really step back and go back to the basics of balance and everything else that you need to do just to produce a robust athlete. So yeah, I agree with you, Graham.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we spoke about. You're walking exactly through the same process of how much work capacity can you put in, specific training to their event, force production, functional movement. Although some of the functional movement may look a little bit different, you're still trying to create force in the right plane to get an athlete to move quick. You're still trying to achieve, a stiff ankle, midfoot into the floor, under the hip, so that you can produce force. Yeah, and that's your aim.